Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's talk. Sorry to keep you waiting a little bit. Today's talk is on Trevor Leggett, A Man of the Way, Part 2. Now, hopefully some of you were here for the first talk, but Trevor Leggett was a colossal man, a giant of a man, a genius in various traditions. And he wrote some seminal books. He brought Judo to this country. The list is endless. My friend Tony, who I've known for many years, he trained with Trevor, a friend, a student, for many, many years, and it's nice to see some other people here who knew Trevor so well. And it's very nice that we have this talk today because Trevor was an integral part of the Buddhist Society for many, many years. And those of you who would have gone to the summer schools, Trevor was an essential part, and his talks, lectures were entertaining, illuminating, and profoundly thought-provoking. Which is why we hold him so dear to our hearts. And I was privileged enough to have spent some time living with Trevor for a month or so, and it was one of the most transformative experiences of my life, certainly, and I'm sure Tony and those others here, nice to see some of you after a long time, you'd all say the same thing. So, yes. That much more, please, Tony.
Thank you.
Do get started, thank you.
Well, reverence to my teacher, Trevor Leggett, who was a wonderful man. And I'd like to talk tonight about a few aspects of Trevor. Firstly, his character, and an aspect of his character that needs to be brought out today, not because it's in doubt, but because I fear that something is happening. Perhaps it's an older man's perception that there has been a moral deterioration in the world, but it's certainly my perception. I don't apologize for this. People come to Buddhist groups, I know. Perhaps nobody comes here, but I know that people go to other Buddhist groups who think that they can take up Buddhism, as it were. Sometimes it's just to take up an appendage to their fascinating personalities and to add one extra gleam of loveliness to themselves. Others come half curious and not sure what Buddhism is, but it's the state in which they come that's worrying. We ought to arrive. My friend Udayan refers to a clean state, being clean and cleaning. We ought to arrive not being the sort of people who lie or who can smile at others while having the knife into them. And I'm not preaching at anybody here by selection. You're probably all very good people. But I'm concerned about this as a general phenomenon, that we need to draw attention to how these people live. Trevor was not a moral preacher, but his being spoke of morality. Just to go back to the beginning, when I was 22, I attended my first series of talks, classes in fact, not talks, in the institution where Trevor was located. And for the first 6 or 7 talks, it was a different speaker each week. They all mentioned spiritual power. And I sort of was hoping that one of them would explain what this strange, to me then, strange term meant. I had an inkling of what it might mean, but when this Mr. Leggett walked in with his enormously impressive quietness, it was like silence moving into silence. When he mentioned spiritual power, which he did very quickly, I did this, and he said, yes. I said, what is spiritual power? And he said, it's consciousness of immortality. Consciousness of immortality. I think we should hold on to that when we listen to somebody like Trevor Leggett, because he wasn't an ordinary man. At least he wasn't at the age of 55 when I met him. I was 22. He lived a very careful life. And this wasn't a careful life in the neurotic sense. This was a careful life in the sense that he was disciplined. He had a daily timetable of discipline which he adhered to rigidly, but not so rigidly that he wasn't flexible. He lived that discipline on all the planes, there was always strict honesty, even embarrassingly so. I won't go into some of the occasions when it was embarrassing, because it was embarrassing to me on one occasion. And his speech was, I didn't realize this at the time, but his speech was an exact expression of the rules for speech as I once read them in Buddhism, and certainly in the yoga rules, excuse me, of speech. It always had a certain sweetness about it. It was pleasant. It was beneficial. It was true. And it wasn't provocative. Pleasant, beneficial, true, causing no excitement or resentment. Although resentment was to come later on when as with all spiritual figures, he was attacked. But he smiled at those attacks. So he followed more and stricter rules than we could imagine. He was ascetic in everything. Everything in his life was clean, neat, and tidy. Absolutely everything. But his asceticism didn't smack of what his great friend Miss Waterhouse described as an image of monks, cadaverous and determined, flagellating themselves in damp, dark cells. His asceticism fed an invigoration of the body and the mind, and it was never a sense of monks and misery. It was a sense of what he described as what he translated as vastness, no holiness, vastness, like Bodhidharma. Well, I've sort of tried to think for years and years and years now, since his parting, how I could briefly describe Trevor, just in, say, a sentence. And for a reason that needn't concern us here, I had to read part of the book of Job recently. And I came across a description of God in the book of Job. And Job is describing God, and he said, he passes me by before I perceive him, and changes before I notice. I think that's a very good description of Trevor Leggett. And many people who knew him to this day, I know this because I've asked people certain questions to bring out what they perceived of him. They didn't get what he was up to. If he gave you an answer to a question, it was never the full answer. You thought it was, but it wasn't. And I suddenly realized this when he showed me something, which I'll be showing you tonight. I don't know Chinese. I'm not a calligrapher, but I'll show you something that he showed me from the Chinese. And his way of showing things was he'd give you something, and you'd think, yes, that's the answer. And then you'd go away, and it would come up again in a week or two or sometime. And he'd ask you a question, and you'd give the answer. You see, you'd have worked at it. And it wasn't the answer. What he did was he'd give you a half of something, and you were expected to use your own inquiry, your own sense of inquiry, to bring out what it was. Now, I'm going to say he was as subtle as it's possible to be, so subtle that, as I've said, many of us missed many opportunities in his teaching. This is a tree. As I said earlier on, it's 2 weeks old and about 150 years old, drawn by an artist friend of mine. It's the way we see trees in the West. You see the magnificent development of the branches and the trunk, slight hint of the roots, and that's it. There's nothing wrong with this tree. It's a beautiful tree. I've known it for 50 years, and it's been a friend of mine for that long. What Trevor showed me when we discussed the tree was this. You'll have to excuse my lack of artistic finesse or calligraphy. This, he said, is the Chinese character for a tree. This part is the surface. but this is the roots. And he said, if we go to other cultures, the Far East, the Near East, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indian, we'll find different ways of perceiving that are helpful to us spiritually. And he left it at that. He didn't say any more. But later on, I was listening to a verse from an Upanishad, which I can recite. These are the texts that Trevor was going through with me and with others. I'm not a Buddhist scholar. I admire Buddhism and have a lot of time for it, but I can't quote. There must be equivalent Buddhist texts. But this text is from the Sweta Upanishad, and it says, the one who himself without colour, we might think that the root is slightly without colour. It's not without colour, but compared to the tree it is. The one who himself without colour, by the many and varied application of his power, distributes many colours in his hidden purpose, and into whom its end and its beginning, the whole world dissolves. Well, I don't need to read you the last part of the verse, it's not relevant for tonight. But the root is what is really providing the colour above ground. It's the whole, of course the tree is a unity. It's a unity. And this came up, and I realised that this had something to do with this one who himself without colour distributes many colours, and into whom its end and its beginning, the whole world dissolves. What is that? And he, when I managed to get to that question, the remark was, you see this every 24 hours. What? The whole world dissolves in something. And I had to work it out for myself. It's deep sleep. There's something in deep sleep that we need. If you're deprived of sleep, and unfortunately it's happened, people first go mad and then they die, deprived of sleep for long enough. It's a form of torture. But the other aspect of this is that there is something in us. The whole world dissolves in it every night when we enter deep sleep. Or a general anesthetic will do, but it's the same effect. Nothing. There's nothing. And yet we're terrified of nothing. We're absolutely terrified. Trevor told me that when he was training senior, but only senior, Judo men, there was a level of, I think it's black belt level, where they had to undergo a pretty tough training. And the tough training meant them being put out, being made unconscious, pressure somewhere, I think it was on the neck. And it had to be precisely timed. And he said the reactions of some of these remarkably brave men to being made unconscious. Of course, you could die if you weren't resuscitated properly. So there was a death threat involved. But he said it showed this fear, and it's a meaningless fear. Death is down the track, and if you want to do judo, you've got to go through this. If you want to go through advanced judo, you've got to go through this. But more things came out later, and when I realised that Trevor had only ever, even in the most obvious matters, given part of an answer, he expected people to have a vigorous sense of inquiry, and if they didn't, that was their problem. He would give hints, and he told me once, he said, if ever you're teaching, if anybody's any good, by the way, I'm not a teacher, I don't want to be a teacher. If anybody's any good at all, he said, don't praise them. He said, if they're any good at all, they'll make it themselves. He said, now if they're very weak and they're never going to make it, then to maybe, just maybe awaken the sleeping ambition to do well, you can give them a little bit of encouragement, but only if they're very weak or sick or something like that. But I came back to this character again, this tree, and I realised that Trevor taught that in the outer reaches of knowledge, there is no root. These roots are human, the human roots of the individuality. And it's good, and it was quite clear that this is what he wanted us to do, in order to reach the state of emptiness, the state of conscious emptiness, which is in deep meditation. We need to have a pretty good knowledge of our own roots. Now, in most people, there are two big ones, which you can find different. These are not specific things that Trevor taught. They are things I derived from this image that he gave. In most people, there's a housekeeper, and the housekeeper. What the housekeeper does is the housekeeper stays within the system. Perhaps it's the pattern of your life. The system is the pattern of your life, and the housekeeper stays at home and makes the system work. Makes sure that there's hot water available, makes sure that the beds are made, the laundry's done, that the men don't get too dirty, which men tend to do, and the children are looked after. But the housekeeper isn't necessarily a female, and in fact, if you find a different name, for instance, in a school, the housekeeper function would be the administrator of a school. And we've all got this element in us. Another main function, which I call the student, is the one who isn't confined to the housekeeper function, but wants to grow in knowledge, wants to be free of the necessities implied in housekeeping, and wants to grow, wants adventure, intellectual adventure, spiritual adventure, wants to develop their potentialities. It's important to understand that these are here. Now, I've just made a note of a few of the names that I've given to these roles, and I've hidden some of them from you because I'm entitled to a private life as well. I'm not in a confessional mode, but the administrator and manager in the school, probably the manager will be the head teacher, and sometimes the head teacher is a very, very poor administrator, and the administrator is very often they're very good at what they do, but they're restricted to that. But Trevor didn't believe in these restrictions. He thought that we should all try to have little adventures with our functions and not be too firmly cast in roles. There's the inquirer, there's the lazy one, there's the gambler, there's the cheat, there's the sniper, the complainer, and there's the Buddha. Now, these are the roots. And as long as these things feel like the self, they will stop us, they will stop our growth, and they will stop us in life too. People who are so paralyzed by the need to keep their housekeeper function. Oh, there's a new computer system coming. Oh God, no, I can't deal with that. And Trevor said, no, do deal with it. If somebody said, oh, I'm not very good at mathematics, he'd say, get good. And he caused many people who felt these restrictions and limitations of what they felt to be their roots. And he took them out of them. He took them quite away from them. If you want to know your roots, keep a notebook. Now, I asked him about this when we were friends, rather than when I was a sort of a revering student. I said, did you keep a notebook? And he said, well, I did for a while. But he said it was too painful. So he stopped after a while. But he said, I knew what they were. I knew what I needed to know. And I mentioned last time a famous psychoanalyst, Dr. Harris, told him that he had a remarkable knowledge of his own insides, as it were, his psychic insides. But his mode was religious, and he said that this work on the roots of identifying. By the way, some people, I asked a scholar, a Chinese scholar, a couple of weeks ago, about this symbol, and I said, is the average Chinese person aware that this is the top of the tree and this is the roots? He said, they're not interested in such things. He said, but you're right, they are the roots. And I then bumped into another Chinese person whom I don't know very well a little while later, and she said the root in her part of China looked like this. So these also were roots, but it shows that the multiplicity of roots that Trevor spoke of, or that he didn't speak of, but he showed, was meant to be followed up. I wished I'd followed it much earlier than I did, in fact. Well, that's the self-analysis work that has to go on in any spiritual path. You won't make much progress unless you have some idea of what's going on inside you, of this naming of roots. You don't, and it's something that should not be shared. It's something that should be kept as a private matter, because experience shows, I'm afraid, that when you tell people a little about your roots, anything you say can and will, you know the rest of it, it'll be used. Even with the best will in the world, people will use it. So the next thing, the next aspect of the teaching, which Trevor emphasized, was the what he called footprints. For 300 years after the death of the Buddha, the only symbol was footprints. And I remember him saying, we've lost this lecture, by the way. I'm going to see if I can find it in his archive, but it's called Footprints, I think. But no images of the Buddha were allowed by his followers for the first 300 years. And sometimes the footprint was stylized as a wheel and became his Dharma chakra. But the footprints image, he said, is very old in India. And it's in the Upanishads as well, as you would expect. It's in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And there they said that you can find the spirit of this, the hidden spirit of this universe, in the same way as you find an animal that has been lost. In the ancient Himalayas, of course, no fencing, and animals did wander through the pastures. I've been in those pastures, and you can see they're vast. And if an animal wanders, the only way to find it, or presumably then there wasn't any form of identification, but the footprint. And so you had to follow the footprints. And Trevor meditated on this passage in the Upanishad. It's in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, 147. And he said there are two elements to this. He said one element of the footprints of the cosmic self, the Buddha nature, Brahm, whatever you like to call it, is in the sacred scriptures. And the other is, if you follow the scriptures, if you really follow them and meditate on them and try to immerse your mind in them, you will find that you will discover a footprint in your own mind, or perhaps more than one. You will find footprints in your mind. Now, the verse he took was one that begins with the words, I am the father of this world, the mother, the controller. And you're expected to meditate on that. And you think, well, what good will that do, meditating on I am the father, the mother, the controller? I've tried meditating on it, and I didn't get all that far. But he thought that if you meditated on this verse over a long period of time, and I haven't meditated over a long period of time, but later on, after that lecture, I thought, what is an Upanishadic verse that I find personally intriguing, attractive, mysterious, pleasant to read, and easy to remember? And I came across one in the Shweta Upanishad, and it's a verse that had always mystified me. And it reads, Thou art woman, thou art man, thou art the youth and the maiden. The old man tottering along on his staff art thou. It is thou who art born and reborn, and who face all ways in the universe. So, although I didn't understand the meaning of this, I meditated, and I found that there was something in this that I hadn't noticed before. I remembered every 24 hours, and of course, an answer came in a dream. In a dream, you're woman and you're a man. A man walks up to you. It's in some sense you. A woman talks to you. It's you. Even if it's your mother, it's you. The youth and the maiden is you. The weather is you. The climate is you. The sky is you. The memories are you. The technology is you. Everything is you. And this insight that this is where this verse... Now, like Trevor, I can only take this so far. You've got to work on these things. If you think this is interesting, there are many more steps to go with this. But it solves problems. There was Trevor or Dr. Shastri, one of them gave the story of a man who had a debate coming up in Parliament. And he was very, very worried about this debate because his career depended on him being successful. And he had a dream then, perhaps he called it a nightmare, in which a point he hadn't thought of came out of... He dreamed that he was actually in Parliament discussing this, debating it, and a point he hadn't thought of came out of the mouth of his opponent. It was a devastating point. And he woke up in a sweat and thinking, oh no, I haven't spotted the key thing in all of this, even though I'm speaking for it. I haven't spotted the weakness. And a friend whispered in his ear, well, you were the clever one who spotted it in the dream. That man was speaking your thoughts. The real guy may not have thought of this. And indeed he didn't, and the debate was carried for the man who found a refutation of his own argument in the dream. We don't expect honour among politicians, do we? But further to that point about this being in a dream, these explanations that the world disappears and dissolves and that you are everything, they are not in the Vedantic philosophy and the Buddhist philosophy, indeed, that Trevor followed. They're not theoretical. They're actual realities. And I could imagine a Zen teacher saying, well, there's the dream. Now wake up. Now there is no dream. This is true now. There is something here that is you and me, and that we're painted on this, like a painting on a screen. We're live paintings. We don't know what we're going to say next. We don't know what other people are going to say next. We don't know what memory is going to come into the mind next. But there's something underneath all of this that is alive and at work. The thought that the world is a mental phenomenon is constantly being brought up in life. And it was brought up famously. I'm going to do a bit of reading. It was Boswell recording the life of Johnson, and this is Saturday, the 6th of August, 1763, 250 years ago. Coming out of church, this is Boswell's writing. We stood talking for some time together of Bishop Berkeley's ingenious sophistry to prove the non-existence of matter, and that everything in the universe is merely ideal. I observe that though we are satisfied his doctrine is not true, it is impossible to refute it. I shall never forget the alacrity with which Johnson answered, striking his foot with mighty force against a large stone, till he rebounded from it. I refute it thus, he said, kicking it. Now, Trevor related this passage because we had just listened to somebody saying that the idea that the world is a mental expression, and purely a mental, was ridiculous. No argument, just assertion. Ridiculous. And Trevor related the passage at one of the many meetings over a cup of tea in his flat. And he said, Boswell does not record that 5 minutes after refuting Berkeley, Dr. Johnson awoke from having kicked the rock in his dream. Well, this is Trevor's take. It's easily possible that this could have happened. It didn't. But a dream is only a relative dream. And he used to say, when you walk into a room full of people, he said, if you look at their faces, he said, you can see that they're dreaming. The dream may be, I forgot to put the laundry button in, so I'll have to do it when I go home. Or it might be something more profound. Or it might be, I wonder what kind of foolishness this man is going to speak to us. Could be anything. But people are in a dream a lot of the time. And the Vedantic interpretation of this is that there is a reality, and that it is the mother and father of the universe. It's friendly to us. And we may think, with all that's happened in the world, that it isn't friendly. But as he said, if people are not capable of worship, then they have to find some other way. He knew that he held that the Buddha did not want worship. If he had wanted worship, he'd have left all these statues in his own lifetime, or his followers would have allowed them. He just wanted to leave that footprint as though he'd just been there a moment before, and you should please take the next step and follow him in that way. He didn't want this personal worship, but he did want us to move. That's why it's a footprint and not a print of a cushion or a seat. This may sound elementary, but we will not make progress if we don't make these things an actual realization. And as we'll hear from Trevor later on, when he speaks, he thought that Goethe, the great German, had the best mind, best European mind ever. And he often quoted a phrase from Goethe, which I've only recently discovered after searching it for 30 years. I don't speak German. I've been looking for it through people who know German, through various documents that claim to record every word that Goethe wrote. And strangely enough, this expression didn't turn up in German. And forgive my pronunciation if you speak German. The expression is Bewusstlosigkeit, conscious unconsciousness. Trevor often spoke to me of this. I don't know how frequently he spoke to others. Perhaps others who are here will remember him speaking of entering the unconscious consciously. But he spoke to me on several occasions about this. And when I came across it in a book by two of the greatest German scholars, English German scholars of their time, Wilkinson was one of them. I can't remember the second name, but anyway, they were both began with W. They expressed this thing, this Bewusstlosigkeit, as a paradox, and they said, no doubt this is a paradox that he used to show us that things that are opposites in our experience are in fact part of a unity. But Trevor did not take that point of view. He was emphatic that entering consciously into the unconscious was a state. And the scholars who wrote this book, the book is called in English Goethe, Poet and Thinker. They said, when they were referring to it, that Goethe spoke of this state, not paradox, he spoke of this state with great enthusiasm and approval. This is the way he spoke of a state. And the part of the insights from the previous points made about the false roots, these are the false roots of the human. We're expected to enter into a meditation which is traditional, which has been prepared by people who've trodden the path before us. And so it's safe ground, it's it's been tested and tried. And when we enter those meditations, we're treading a traditional path. It's much better to do that than to start inventing things of our own. They've been tested by generations and generations. And this would be analogous to the thing he also often quoted, that however clever the chess player, if he hasn't studied the theory, he can't, in one game, make up the ground for 200 years of analysis by experts. And Trevor was astonished that he could beat his own teacher at chess. But as he said, I had studied the theory. I had studied those 200 years and that weeded out all the flaws and found the best route into the game. So I had huge advantages. Dr. Shastri had not. But he learned his own lesson from the way Dr. Shastri played, and he never failed to learn a lesson from Dr. Shastri in the chess. But if we enter into meditation and we find that we have entered into the unconscious, where there's nothing, there's absolutely nothing, because that entry into the unconscious will have been preceded by throwing away pictures in the mind. Oh, the ironing. How dare she? I was young once. All this stuff is thrown away. And when we become expert at throwing it away, we find gradually, especially if we can look up, as it were, in Buddhism, probably looking up to the great Buddhas of the past, the great Buddhas of the present, and those who will come in the future. In yoga, we look to a Lord, a conscious God, and if we can look up, when we were small, as children, we had to look up to our parents, we had to look up to our teachers. But when we get this comprehensive feeling of unity through this reverence for the past, reverence seems to be something that's fast disappearing from our civilization. But this is an important emotion. It's not just an emotion, it has a good cognitive basis. Some things are reverable. You see it in paintings, you see it in architecture. We can have reverence, reasonable reverence. It's a reasonable thing. Well, if you enter into this sort of unconsciousness, don't be afraid. It happens that people do get into fear over this. I want to pass on to a personal experience with Trevor, to go away from this rather abstract stuff. I came across a poem in an old journal by Dr. Shastri, a poem by Dr. Shastri, his teacher, Hari Prasad Shastri, in the old Self-Knowledge. It was in 1961, 5 years after his passing. I came across it in the 70s or 80s. Well, I was struck by this poem. It was called The King. And it had very simple and clear language, but yet it clearly contained a genuine mystery. So on the weekend, I saw Trevor several times a week, every week for years, but on the weekend there was about 4 or 5 hours every Saturday. I took it to him, and I said, I've been reading this poem and reading it, and I feel it's important, by Dr. Shastri, but I can't get to the bottom of it. It's got some secret in it. So I read the poem, and when I'd finished reading it, I looked up at him, and he was smiling, and he said, I wrote that. And he said, not by Dr. Shastri, I wrote that. And I thought, what? You wrote a poem? He said, yes, I wrote that poem. And he said, I've also done art. And I knew him well enough by then to say, well, actually, I've never seen any art of yours. And he said, you might not, but I have done it. And I said, I didn't know you had these interests as well as everything else. He said, yes. He said, this is something that I do. It's an activity I do. It's a cycle. And he said, you know, I've often spoken about how Japanese women rearrange the furniture in a room. They don't have a lot of things in the room. He said, an old man like me said, when you look around the room, look, it's a fossil record of everywhere I've been and everything I've ever done or bought. And he said, like all old people. But he said, we need to not die in our own rooms. So he said, every 5 years, I try to do something new. He said, if you become a big fish, he said, it might be because the pond is small, or maybe not, but you can feel that you're becoming a big fish. And maybe you are becoming a big fish. But he said, that won't keep you alive. He said, the thing to do, there's an antidote to becoming a big fish, and that's to become a small one. And he said, the way to do that is to enter a field in which you're nothing. You're absolutely nothing. You have no achievements, you have no reputation, you have nothing to fear because you're such a little one. And he said, so poetry is one that I did. I'll read the poem. It's the only poem of Trevor's that I've discovered so far, that I promise to keep looking. Here it is. The King. We had gone far into the desert. Every night we pitched our tents and made a fire as directed by the guide. He was reputed to have been in the country to which we were going. Some even said he was a native. But he spoke rarely of its ways and customs, preferring to talk of the necessary tasks of the journey and to urge the need for haste. We thought, perhaps after all, he only knows it from hearsay. We were all alone in the desert. Only sometimes, in the night, we heard through our dreams the sound of horses' hooves, and then a faint clank of weapons, and voices saying, a message of greeting for the king. And we wondered, drowsily, where in this desert there could be a king, that warriors should come so far to bear him greeting. This is just like all those little remarks that Trevor made, where you thought you could grasp something. But there's a lot. I'll leave this copy with somebody for anybody who'd like to read it. But there's a lot of work to still be done on this poem. There's a lot of mystery in it. I asked him about the poem, and I said, why the cycle of activity? And he said, well, you've got a book about it. And I said, I have? He said, yes. It's the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. When you start this thing where you're nothing, and you then start to write poetry, or paint, or draw, or do calligraphy, or whatever, the beginner's mind opens up. And this is where our life comes from. We've got to keep trying to find beginner's mind. I didn't feel I dared ask him, after he'd given me so much, what his other activities had been, but he'd done it for a long time. There were constants in his life. There were certain books that he went back to over and over and over again. When he was, I don't know if he ever stopped reading Bernard Shaw's masterpiece, Back to Methuselah. This is a wonderful book by a wonderful writer, and I say that not because he's Irish, but Trevor directed me to the part, it's about near the middle of the book, I think. It's a while since I've read it myself, where there are long livers and short livers, and the long livers live in a community in the west of Ireland. They live for very long, hundreds of years. But when the short livers, people like us, who seem to only live a short time, go to visit them, there's always a danger that they'll die from an illness, so they have to be taken by guides to look for the symptoms of this illness. And the symptom is discouragement. And the disease and the deadly illness is discouragement. He didn't say any more about it, and I still have to unravel a great deal. That looks like an answer, doesn't it? But it's not. I know this man to some extent, or I'm beginning to know him. This is not the answer, but it's a clue, which I'm very happy to share. Well, I begged him to tell me the meaning of the poem because I had read it and reread it and reread it. And he said, well, and his explanation, as usual, was terse. He said, crossing a desert, you're going to death. One who has been to death many times knows that there is an oasis. It is still a hard journey, but it is different because you know. This conversation took place on the 22nd of January 1990. Well, perhaps Uday, you could take charge of that and pass it on, if anybody. Well, I've been speaking for quite a while. One of the things that Trevor did, I'll finish on this. One of the things that he did when we went on meditation weekends with him, he liked to encourage people, even when he was possibly correcting people. He had encouragement in mind that was obvious to me. It took a long time for it to be obvious, but he was always urging people onto the path. Meditate, meditate, meditate. Don't be discouraged. Don't mind the old soldiers who say, oh, do something else. Meditation's too difficult. Or, it's what is there? There's nothing once you've meditated for a while, nothing. But he would quote Patanjali and say, if you meditate, if you really meditate, the meditation will empty itself of itself. You may not think it will, but if you keep it up, it will. And then in that emptiness, then life begins. The activity that he got us to indulge in after a week's meditation or perhaps a long weekend, as was often the case, was, he didn't refer to that again in terms of the human flaws, but he'd say, I suppose you have a fault or two, which was very kind of him to say that. He said, so please take a little slip of paper and write the fault down. And he would have pre-arranged always that there was some kind of receptacle just outside the building. And he'd say, we'd have newspaper, and he'd light a fire, and he'd say, now, throw it in the fire, let it blaze up, and then it's gone. It is actually gone. And there was something about the power of his presence that did make a space for us when he did this. It was wonderful. Anybody who feels themselves still to be an individual, and that's most of us, I think. There was a meditation, and I will finish on that. Trevor said, suffering is coming at us like an express train, and unless we follow the path, we won't be able to get out of the way in time. But if we feel that we've been trying and that it's very difficult, there's this meditation which came from the tradition that he was in. I make a soft bed of all impediments and sorrows. I make a pillow of my despair and disappointments. I light the candle of identity with the one who is without a second, and I disappear as an individual in the flame. If we can do this meditation over a period of time, not when the doctor says, as the doctor said to me earlier this year, I'm not looking for sympathy. Oh, I'm afraid it's cancer. It's gone now. It was here at my last talk in February. Tiny, tiny little thing hidden in a fold. Well, there was a fold here, but it's gone. They've taken the ear, part of the ear, and it was cancer. Don't wait for that moment to do a meditation like this. Do this meditation when you feel that you've been ill, when you feel you've been weak, and do it for some time. 6 weeks is the traditional time to do a meditation like this. And it will change the roots. If you do it with a bow to whatever the reality is, to God, to your particular God, to Buddha, to the traditions of the Buddhas. If you do this meditation, it will help you when the time comes. You may even be able to have a good laugh when he says it's cancer or it's the heart. We can't do much. You'll be able to take the shock. You'll be out of the way. Well, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you. Now we listen to Trevor.
There are many examples of inspiration. Now, one man, he was a sage, but he lived in the country, by the sea. A teaching by him. Somebody came and said, I practice kindness and goodness as best I can. I pray. I feel exalted sometimes. I'm able to do some good, but then I relapse. I find I'm getting dishonest. I can't resist certain temptations. I know I'm doing harm, but I go on doing it. It's all leaked away. And then I try again. And I pray and I do austerities and practices, and then again I feel I'm becoming pure. And then it all leaks away. And the teacher went into his little cottage and he got a sieve. And he said, now, fill this sieve with the seawater. So the man stood there and he scooped up the water and he put it into the sieve. And again. And the teacher said, this is your situation. So the inquirer said, well, what do I do? How can I ever fill the sieve with seawater? And the teacher took the sieve and threw it into the sea. It floated for a little bit, and then it sank. And he said, now it's full of seawater. While you stand on your own individuality, and you try to ladle virtue and purity and inspiration into yourself, it will go in, but it'll soon leak away through your heels. You have to make a great jump into God and sink your individuality in God. Then you will be full. We can say, well, how does one know? It's an idea. All these things are ideas. We scoop up ideas and we put them into ourselves, and it seems to have an effect, but after a time, things are as they were before. Well, again, this sort of story is meant to be meditated on. There's a meaning in it that's quite different from the surface meaning. Quite different. Just as the parables in the New Testament. There's a secret in them. And he said this to his disciples when they asked him for the meaning of the parables. How dull you are. If you don't understand this parable, how will you understand any parable? How is inspiration going to come into daily life? Well, I'll give one or two examples from a problem which many people have of bringing up small children. Not so easy. How would inspiration show itself there? There's a problem. Should the child be left to its own devices? Bertrand Russell believed that children were naturally curious, naturally wanted to learn, and he founded a school on that basis. But he found that children spent their time bullying the smaller ones than themselves. It turned out to be wrong. On the other hand, are you going to learn, set them to learn, as my generation had to learn, hundreds of Latin verbs, most of which never occur in ordinary Latin texts at all, but there just happen to be exceptions to a rule? What's going to be the method? How's one going to do it? Well, now first, this is an example of a little girl. She was very wild, which is not a good thing for a girl to be in the East, in most countries in the East. She was 4 or 5, and her parents died. And she went to live in the house of an aunt who was a spiritually advanced woman, but had very little time to give to the girl. She made arrangements for her to go to school, but for controlling her behavior was quite difficult. She took her to the temple, and she showed her the statue of the Buddha, which is sitting with the hands in this particular gesture. The hands are like this. It has a particular meaning which doesn't matter now. And she showed the little girl the image. And they bowed before the Buddha and they prayed. The little girl was very impressed. Then the aunt said to her, now, when you do something wrong, the Buddha knows. And his hands change from these circles, they change to triangles. And when the Buddha forgives you, they change to circles again. Well, she was impressed, and when she did something wrong, she used to run to the temple and see if the Buddha's hands were in triangles or whether she'd been forgiven. And she found they were circles, and she felt she'd been forgiven. Now that woman, she later on became an important figure in her local town. She was asked about this. And they said, weren't you annoyed at having been fooled like that? Because really you were, weren't you? You were being fooled. And she said, oh no, I wasn't being fooled. I came to realize that the Buddha's hands would always be like this. But that made me realize the Buddha would forgive, was forgiving me, all the time. And then I felt, I don't want the Buddha to have to forgive me. I want to do what's right so that he won't have to forgive me. And she said at times of great temptation or great fear, this had been a support to her. The vivid image of the Buddha, calm, with this slight smile and the hands in the circles. But this was a case of inspiration. The aunt found from her inspiration what would direct that little girl, and in the end inspire that little girl. Inspiration is attained through meditation, and classically, in Patanjali, the most important road to meditation is the repetition of this syllable Om, one of the names of God. Om, 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 and feeling the vibration. Now, this is something again which people will take to for an hour, 2 hours, a week, month, and then give up. Goethe was perhaps the finest mind there has ever been in Europe. And in his Faust classics, the 2 parts, there are many secrets yogic secrets. He discovered by himself many of the secrets of yoga. Now, in the second part, if we look carefully, Faust is looking for inspiration of a particular kind. And he asks Mephistopheles, who represents the discursive intellect, who can't himself go into meditation, but can read books or find out about it, what do I do? How do I enter inspiration? And Mephistopheles says you have to leave everything. He said, imagine you going to the ends of the earth. There would still be something. But in that region, there's nothing. Faust says, how do I go? Do I go up? Do I go down? Mephistopheles says, no, it's not a direction. So Faust says, well, how can I get there? And then, because he has to, because Mephistopheles has to do what Faust says, he produces a little key. He says, this is the key. This will take you down to the realm, or up to the realm of inspiration. And Faust says, what, that little thing? And Mephistopheles says, don't despise it. Hold it firmly. And he holds it firmly. And he says, it's changing. It's shining. It's shining. It's flashing. It's flashing. We can see this is a clear reference, the object becoming radiant, as Patanjali says. The little key, which looks so small and trivial, like a repetition of a name or of Om. Don't despise it. Hold it firmly. Imitation is a good thing, but it's not inspiration. When we learn art or the piano, for a time we have to imitate the technique and the interpretation, but the time comes when the teacher will say, no, find your own tempo. Then he says, well, what's the proper tempo for this piece? No, find your own. Then he goes out and buys some gramophone records and plays it like Arao plays it. No, not like that. Find your own. Then he has to find something from within. Not by imitation, but something new. Now the last story of the children. This is a famous story from Chinese history. The next sage after Confucius was Mencius, perhaps an even greater man. A great scholar and a great hero who said to a prince, I hate the princes in their silks and furs when the common people are starving. That might have cost him his life. His mother was a sage, and she brought him up. The father was dead. And when he was 5, he was to go to school. The mother was a weaver, and a good one, but they were not rich, but she got the money to send him to school. And she sent him off, and she was working in the summer in the garden on a beautiful piece of embroidery that she'd just begun. With the gold threads, it was going to be a beautiful picture. So she took him to school and left him there and came back and was working. Then she looked up and she saw the boy at the gate. She picked up a knife which they used to cut the threads, and she slashed the embroidery that she'd done, the bit she'd done. Then she looked at him and said, I have done the same as you have. He turned round and went back to school. He became the greatest scholar of his century. Now, when he was in difficulties, and the Chinese language is not a very easy one, when he was in difficulties, when he felt like abandoning it, when he took on some very difficult task and seemed overwhelmed by it, that picture of his mother would have come into his mind. I have done the same as you have. And he would have been able to go back. This is an example of inspiration in daily life. And our teacher told us that these cases, there are many of them which are hardly known, but that people who practice, who do spiritual practices, will give an inspiration and a courage to the people whom they meet, even unconsciously. And this is one of the, not exactly tests, but one of the marks of spiritually advanced people, that after we see them, when we come away, we're able to do things that we've been frightened of, or that we've had a revulsion against doing, although they ought to be done. There's a new strength and a new courage. And they say in the classics, there are three gifts, and the lowest is the gift of food and money, because although it's necessary sometimes, but when the man has eaten it and spent it, he's as he was before. The second one is the gift of courage, which is a much higher gift, because that will last. And the third gift is the gift of wisdom, not imitating others' conduct, but a living inspiration from within himself. So we're told in these ways, inspiration must be creative in ordinary life. Well, thank you for listening. This is what I had to say.
Very much. Are we taking any questions? That was wonderful to hear Trevor again,
yes.
And it was a great talk and brought back many memories and lot of seeds for contemplation there.
Well, if there are any questions, I'm happy to respond to them.
Please.
Well,
a good sign, silence. Just like to say from my own experience, Trevor was a very humorous man as well, wasn't he?
Yes.
There was a sparkle. Yes. Eventually, he only had the one eye, but remember the story about the false eye?
Yes.
But there was a tremendous... So please don't get the impression that he was an austere, yogic man full of spiritual power. He was actually an ordinary guy with a lot of humour, and if you knew him personally, you would find that. And there's a message in that, because humour is terribly important in the spiritual way, and a lot of people forget that.
Yes.
And Trevor was the classic example of the opposites transcended, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yes. I was often sore leaving his flat on sore from laughing. Yes,
absolutely.
True. Yes.
But thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was wonderful talk. Wonderful talk. And it's so nice to bring Trevor back, because he's still very relevant.
Yes, he never goes away.
No. Thank you.
Please brought him to life. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oops.
Yes, I'll give it. Thank you for that.
The explanations.